Welcome to the Practical Enneagram. Object relations is not something that I learned either through my study of psychology or my coach's training, because I didn't study psychology, not in a formal context, and object relations is not something that's generally brought into coaching, more in the province of psychotherapy or counselling. What I've learned is it is possible to draw on the wisdom of object relations theory in a coaching context with the support of the Enneagram. And it's Belinda Gore's teaching that has made that possible in my own coaching practice. Belinda, an Enneagram teacher, author, and a few other things, teaches object relations and the Enneagram at the Deep Coaching Institute. Because I didn't ask Belinda in this interview to go through each type's object relations pattern, and because I slightly regretted that, I've included in the outro that information. So I'll go through briefly what each style's object relations pattern is. This is an area that does benefit from sit-down contemplation and not something that can be completely accessed in a podcast, I think, but it should give you an idea of whether this is something that you want to double-click on in your own coaching practice or for your personal development. I hope that you enjoy. I know you as my dear teacher of object relations and the Enneagram, and also integrator of the Diamond approach, inquiry work and the Enneagram. But your work takes several forms. Can you say a little about what you get up to in the world?
I get up to a lot of things.
Yeah.
In fact, I teach, of course, as you have been part of the Object Relations and Enneagram course, and I teach with the Deep Coaching Institute. Mm-hmm. So we're teaching really mature coaches about utilizing the Enneagram and presence, how to embody presence in coaching work. For 7 years now, I have explored what I call ancient ritual postures, taken from the artwork of Indigenous people around the world. My mentor and teacher, who was a religious anthropologist, discovered that the poses we see in that artwork are in fact ritual instructions for using our bodies to hold a pose that seems to activate the body and maybe the etheric body in a particular way, somewhat in the way that we use body work with meridians and that whole context to align us to be able to shift our awareness so that we can perceive the invisible world of spirit and find guidance. I research that, I teach that, I've published a deck of oracle cards using those postures. I have groups. Yeah. So that's an entire context of my life, in addition to the work with object relations and the Enneagram. Yeah. And I've, in my semi-retirement, have allowed myself to move into being an artist and poet. So I'm enjoying that.
Goodness, there's just so many directions I could go in that I'm going to be disciplined and stay on task. But so moving on to our subjects, I know that for me, when I was looking through Deep Coaching Institute's offerings and I found object relations in the Enneagram, which was around a year ago, I'd never heard of it. And I was obviously immediately enchanted by the prospect of adding a new dimension to Enneagram learning. But I think that's changing slightly in the past year. I'm hearing more people talk about object relations on podcasts and elsewhere. So it seems to be developing on people's radar. But many people who know the Enneagram still don't know object relations. So if you were riding an elevator with such a human, what would you say?
Object relations comes from theorists in the 1940s and 50s who were psychodynamic psychiatrists, that is, of the Freudian tradition, who were trying to understand why some people and children experience psychopathology, and they were investigating the development of personality in our earliest life experience. And they believed that those relationships with others in our early lives were really relationships with objects, because we couldn't understand the complexity of personality, and that we built personality in that way. It was based on psychopathology, but has since been, in my word, redeemed as a way for all of us to understand how our personalities develop, and then to understand the limits of a mental model of personality, so that we can begin to let it go and experience the consciousness of our true nature. Now, that's a long ride on the elevator, but
not too long a ride, I would say. So that's object relations theory. Who was it that came and combined this theory or mapped it with the Enneagram?
I believe that my Enneagram teachers, Don Riso and Russ Hudson, engaged with the notion or the teaching of object relations theory through their involvement with the Diamond Approach work and Hamid Ali or A.H. Almas. Object relations are discussed in the Diamond Approach work. But I learned it first through Don and Russ, who had developed the grid that I teach from in terms of primary objects and dominant affect. I learned that from them. And then when I became involved in the Diamond Approach work, I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine who was in my retreat group, who said, I don't really understand object relations. And I thought, I do a little bit from my work with Don and Russ. Let me go back and investigate. That was about 10 years ago, and I haven't stopped.
Yeah, so it came from that, your friend's initial sort of confusion. You clocked on to that probably being a common confusion.
And mine as well. There was very little I really understood, other than seeing that there was a 3x3 grid with the objects and the affect.
This grid, Belinda, is that contested? So are there people out there speaking about object relations theory and the Enneagram that do not ascribe to the grid and the specific patterns?
I know that Russ Hudson is teaching about object relations. Beatrice Chestnut published an article a number of years ago in the Journal for the International Enneagram Association and utilized a different grid. And I'm not recalling exactly what that was.
Yeah.
I have not seen or heard that she continues to teach object relations in the Enneagram. So other than Russ, I'm not sure who else is teaching any of this material. And since my work comes from his, I'm presuming that we're using a similar matrix.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think Beatrice Chestnut is not actively teaching it. I was just curious about the divergence there. And there's always divergence, isn't there, in Enneagram theory?
Of course.
It seems, yeah.
Yes, because the Enneagram is a teaching. And so what that means is that it has quite a long history, and there are a variety of interpretations, just as Buddhism is a teaching and Christianity is a teaching and Islam. And so you have various schools and various interpretations, different emphasis on different parts of the teaching. So yes, to me, it means that the Enneagram is a living body of work and not limited to the results of a research project.
So you've written about how you came to teach this, and I'm going to include a link to that in the show notes. Can you say a little from a personal perspective about why object relations and the Enneagram became an important emphasis for you?
I have always been interested in elegant patterns that seem to emerge. I have been a student of astrology for that reason. I have been interested in a variety of ways. We've tried to make sense of who we are as human beings. I'm a psychologist. I've been exploring how people show up and how we can learn about ourselves for such a long time.
Mm.
Being in the Diamond Approach work, and I began in 2006, I would encounter reference to object relations. In that work, to my knowledge, I'm not a teacher, but I've not encountered a systematic approach to understanding object relations. And it's such a powerful perspective to understand why we get triggered by people and events in our adult life, and we don't understand really why or what to do about it. And object relations theory helps us both understand that and understand what to do about it.
Thank you. Learning about the Enneagram does give us sort of a set of data around what triggers us in a way, doesn't it? With bringing in object relations as well, or having an understanding of that, is what it's doing sort of adding granularity to the interpersonal realm of where type happens. And
it also is actually, I think, a brilliant way to understand parenting. I was just this past weekend with my 5-year-old granddaughter, who I'm pretty sure now is developing a little type 3 personality like I have. And it was so useful for me to be able to talk with her parents and her other grandmother about, first, she's likely to be more attached to her nurturing figures. And so she is more attached to her mother than her father, even though he's a great dad and spends a lot of time with her. But she is more attuned to her mother and her grandmother. Also, because she's a little 3, she performs well. She has her little concerts on the piano, which she's making up tunes, and she reads and she counts and all those things that I recognize from my own early childhood. And I could advise her parents that even though it's wonderful for her to get attention, she needs to learn that she has inherent value without being able to perform well. And that's something we know from the understanding of the attachment, dominant affect with the nurturing figure, is the desire to get attention and approval, believing that that's the source of love. And she needs to know that she's loved for who she is, no matter whether she performs well or not. That's so important. I wish people had understood that when I was 5 years old.
Yeah. How lucky they are to have that and the benefit of that. And so practically speaking, that might look like her parents giving her praise when she's not necessarily performing, or maybe changing the way they give feedback to her. Yeah.
To say things like, I just love you just the way you are.
Yeah. So lovely. So on to some practical ways we work with these object relations patterns. Repeating questions from Diamond Approach work. Perhaps we can just introduce that as a form of inquiry. What is that, Belinda?
Well, I don't recall exactly where Hamid Ali first encountered repeating questions, but as a tool for inquiry, it has been well developed and widely used in the Diamond Approach work. Repeating questions have the benefit of getting us past our typical thinking about a subject, so that we have to stretch to discover more that we might know, but it's not how we automatically think about things. So a repeating question is usually based on, tell me something that, or what's right about something. And we ask the question again and again and again. So if I were asking you a repeating question, and if I may say, you identify, I believe, with type 4.
Yeah.
Tell me a way you express your inner life creatively, because that's something we know about the 4 dynamic.
Yeah.
And you would say whatever comes to mind. And I would say, thank you. And then I would ask you exactly the same question.
Yeah.
Tell me a way you express creatively. I forgot exactly what words I used, but you wouldn't do this.
Yeah.
So that the difference of nuance of asking it in different ways wouldn't be a distraction. And I start people out maybe doing a repeating question for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes each. But we in Diamond Approach work go on for 15 minutes sometimes.
Yeah.
On one question.
Wow. I just found my way to the Diamond Approach school just late last year, actually. I think a lot of people will because of the Enneagram and because there are Enneagram teachers referring to it every now and then. And that was enough for me to get curious and begin exploring with them. And the first time I'd encountered repeating questions was with you in object relations, but that was the first time I did it in quite an intense way with the Diamond Approach. And yeah, it's unusual. It's a little bit confronting the first time that you do it, or it can be, and then it's not. And then it becomes very powerful and very early to the work. But I already find that in moments when I'm not expecting it, the technique comes to me and helps me to be present in the situation that I'm in, or at least to know where I am internally, to keep some of the focus there, which as a heart type or as a 4, my feeling focus tends to be very externalized. That's what I notice anyway.
Yes, we're both image type. And so our emotions get expressed outwardly, but we're looking for the response.
Yeah. I don't see anyone else combining repeating questions with the Enneagram. I feel like a whole book could be written on this. And, you know, the questions for the type around each of their patterns as a way to explore them is just...
Well, I learned this really from Sandra Maitri. I became involved with the Diamond Approach because Sandra was starting a new retreat group, and she intentionally was going to integrate the Enneagram because she learned it from Claudio Naranjo in California in the 70s. She was in the same Seekers After Truth group with Claudio as Hamid had been. And so she had a strong grounding in the Enneagram directly from Claudio. And a good friend of mine had recently moved to the San Francisco Bay Area. I sent her the notice because I live in Ohio and it's a long plane ride to California. And at the last minute, she said, "Oh, why don't you come for the week?" She had recently moved from Ohio. She said, "We'll just spend the week together. And if we don't like it, we'll go shopping or something." And of course, we loved it. And 6 months later, many people brought their spouses, partners. I brought my husband to the second gathering. So I've been going ever since. But Sandra was utilizing the tools of inquiry and integrating it with the Enneagram. So she was teaching us a combination of Diamond Approach and Enneagram. I hadn't really thought of it that directly, but her modeling of that really has been an encouragement to me to continue to do that kind of work with the Enneagram, to go deeper in the spiritual foundation of it.
I wondered whether you were in the group with Sandra, and I know that she integrates the Enneagram and the Diamond Approach. Because is it the case, Belinda, that Hamid and Karen don't have an in-depth knowledge of the Enneagram? And
it's not their focus. Hamid published a book, Facets of Unity, that is about the holy ideas of the 9 types. So it is at the most pristine development of the 9 points around the circle that we have a window, if you will, onto being or God. And that's what the holy ideas are. So he certainly has a grounding in the Enneagram from his work with Claudio Naranjo, and it's expressed through that book, but it's not taught in the Diamond Approach work. There are many Diamond Approach teachers who don't know the Enneagram.
Bringing our object relations patterns to conscious awareness. So we have repeating questions. We have simply learning about our object relations patterns and just attempting to be more conscious of when they're triggered. Is there anything else to say about how to work with it, Belinda? And what ultimately will we get out of doing that?
Well, as you know, one of my favorite tools I developed is just to ask people when they're triggered in a work situation or a romantic relationship or whatever, to use 5 adjectives to describe the person who they're having difficulty with, and then 5 adjectives to describe how they feel when they're interacting with that person. Let's say it's a supervisor at work. And then as a coach, we read back those descriptions and ask, does this remind you of any other relationship you've had in your life? And usually people recognize that. If they're not talking about who that person is and what that person did yesterday, but looking at just the pattern of who they are and what the interaction seems to be, then maybe it's, oh, yes, that reminds me of my ex-wife. So let's talk about your ex-wife. 5 adjectives, how you felt. Oh, well, actually, that reminds me of my mother, or that reminds me of my relationship with my older sister. So the whole point of the object relation exploration is to recognize that as we are developing our personalities, we develop them according to a template, which is the Enneagram structure. And then we develop the structure based on our experiences. The triggering relationships in our adult lives usually replicate positive or negative relationships early in our lives because we've developed assumptions about who people are and how they treat us and how we relate to them based on those early experiences that are just like building blocks.
But what we'll get out of it is less reactivity, less triggering. And I don't know, is that even true, Belinda? Do we get triggered less, or are we just able to be present with the reactivity in a different way?
Really both.
Yeah.
As a psychologist, in measuring behavioral change even, we talk about frequency, intensity, and duration.
Oh, that's great.
So we get triggered less often, the triggering is less intense, and it lasts for shorter periods of time.
Well, that's perfect. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. There was then mention at some point early on that you're writing a book on. Are you still working on a book?
I write notes, as you know, for students, each of the 14 classes. And 7 for part 1 and part 2. And I thought, well, I'll just put these together in a book form. So I wrote how I came to object relations as the preface. And as I started to put the book together, I realized that if it's going to be a book for more than 24 people to read, it has to be more engaging. Not everybody is wanting to dive into object relations theory, that I need to begin more with what are relationships, who are we as personalities, and then build in the material that we talk about in class.
So that's why sometimes the questions about, is this libidinal ego stuff useful to you? When I read the libidinal ego, honestly, it's just because...
Well, as you know, this last time I thought, do we really talk about libidinal and anti-libidinal ego, which comes from the writings of the early object relations theorists. I need to find more engaging language because the beauty of understanding the libidinal ego is to understand how the so-called frustration types types 7, 1, and 4 can have the energy to keep pursuing things that are frustrating, to keep pursuing what's over the next horizon, or to keep, in your case, what would you say is, what do you keep?
It feels like a form of madness to me, but the libidinal ego helps to explain that thing that 7s, 4s, 1s,
and 1s,
yeah.
That you keep coming back and keep coming back and keep coming back, because the libido, or the libidinal ego, wants pleasure and has made up a story about what will be pleasurable if I can only get there, and will continue to pursue relationships or activities. Think about it. Don't we all do that?
Yeah.
Don't we all say, oh, I could be so happy if only? That's the libidinal ego. I could get my pleasure. I could just get this.
Yeah.
And the anti-libidinal ego is, I could be happy if I could only get away from that. It's the source of pleasure has been hurtful. And so there is a rejection relationship with that source. Those two branches, rejection of frustration, or anti-libidinal and libidinal ego, are really divergent from the core path, which is attachment, which we find things that give us pleasure and we figure out how to get more, and we keep that going. And that's what builds the central ego, our relationships with people and experiences that feel good to us.
That's really clarified it, actually, for me. No longer a scary word. That must have been an interesting challenge for you. You were writing one book, and now effectively you're writing quite a different book, or to make it more accessible. Are you relishing that challenge, or is it making you insane?
No, I'm diverting. Yes, it's making me slightly insane. I'm diverting my attention. I've been writing blogs through the COVID months as a way of giving people a 2,000 word access to various material, both with the Enneagram and with the ancient ritual postures.
Yeah.
So on my website, I just have a variety of blogs.
Yeah,
and
they're really good.
Thank you. That has been the focus of my writing lately. And I know about myself that I will respond to what's expected of me. And I have, I've engaged a webmaster. That's not really her role.
Yeah.
She puts up the blogs and finds the artwork. And I have a commitment to her that I have to turn something in by a certain date. And I do. If I had a contract with a publisher and had to deliver on this material on object relations and the Enneagram, I'm sure I'd get it done. But that's putting the cart before the horse, because usually publishers want to see the structure of the book and the first several chapters. And I just haven't pulled that together in the form I know it needs to be in.
It's a really difficult undertaking. I can completely imagine. But I want you to write the book. Let's find a publisher so that
Yes.
Curious to know how threeness shows up for you now, what you love about being a 3, and what you have struggled to love about being a 3.
I enjoy the fact that I've felt confident enough to do public speaking since I was about 4. Amazing. My mother taught me, 'twas the night before Christmas, and took me, she was a teacher, took me to school, took me to the English class, put me on the teacher's desk so I would recite. I tell about that because I'm sure I was terrified, and it's a good example of how my attachment to my mother was stronger than my fear of public speaking, even at 4 years old. Maybe I was 5, I don't remember. And so doing interviews, teaching classes, teaching workshops, I genuinely enjoy it now, but I could overcome the anxiety and present myself, find the words. And I've liked that because I enjoy teaching very much. I'm someone who has been willing to publish books. I self-published the Oracle Cards book and the poetry in it. And there are a lot of people who would have said, well, no, and I'll just do it because that is part of the three. It's an initiator type, and I can count on myself to finish a project if I know that I need to. I have not loved believing that my value was based on how well I performed and being painfully self-conscious about my image and appearance. Because of course, I'm not perfect, no one's perfect, but I'm not perfect. And the self-image for type 3 is that I need to be the best. And using Louise Hay's language, feeling as though we have to be the best in order to be good enough. And that's a difficult thing. And then we learn to present an image, and we haven't been developing our hearts and our heart's desire. So there's a turning point often in the lives of people who are fundamentally type 3 of realizing that they feel hollow inside. Yeah. It's really difficult.
And a lot of grief, I imagine. Yeah.
Yes.
And, this anxiety and the self-consciousness that you're speaking to, it's just not what we experience threes. I know the threes in my life, I would never guess that there's anxiety, and it's important for us to know about the threes in our lives, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. I remember with a colleague many years ago at an Enneagram conference, and they were probably interviewing type 3s and said, well, what do you do when you wake up and you've got a headache? And Brian and I looked at each other and said, headache? You override the headache. You act as if you don't have it. Several weeks ago, when I got my second COVID vaccination, I really didn't feel well, but I had an object relations class to teach. And so I did. Now, I was sitting in my dining room, which if I'd had to get suited up, if you will, and go to a different location, that would have been different. And during the exercises, I would go lie down on the couch and then come back and do the rest. Later that day, I was on a call with someone in the class who said, I never would have known you didn't feel well. Well, of course, we learn to cover up and present a good front, a good facade.
Yeah. I think, unfortunately, threes end up as repositories for all of we don't like the fact that we can't meet our goals and get things done. And the threes become the people who we don't like because of that.
Yes, that's right.
You don't do subtypes. Is that right, Belinda? You don't ascribe to the idea of, self-pres free, sexual free, social free.
I do believe, I mean, the three instincts are in all of us, and we do tend to prefer one that's our dominant, that's almost unconscious, and then we have a secondary one that we fall back on, and then we have a blind spot, but we're using all three all the time. I don't subscribe to teaching it just as self-pres 3, social 9, because while there are certainly identifiable ways to describe how the 9 interacts with the social instinct, the 9 template, it causes us to think in terms of 27 Enneagram types. Yeah. And I think the fluidity of the movement of instinctual energies isn't adequately addressed in that approach.
That's so clear.
I don't think the instinct are a good way of speaking to the relationship with the primary object.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that served its purpose as an overview of the object relations lens. What follows now is a very light touch description of the object relations patterns for each type. So we have 3 attachment types 9, 3, and 6, typically having challenges with attachments to people, situations, or states that are working for them. Attachment types believe that they need to do something in order to sustain the attachment. So they believe that the relational object gives pleasure and takes it away. The rejection types 8, 2, and 5 expect to be rejected and defend against it in various ways. They deny their own needs, attempting to offer some service or ability as a hedge against anticipated rejection. The frustration types 1, 4, and 7 have the sense of not being able to find what we're looking for or find a true or adequate solution to the frustrated need or desire. I really encourage you to take a class with Belinda for your personal development or as a way to include this powerful lens in your work. My next interviewee guest is Lucille Geef, and we will be talking about vertical development and the Enneagram. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.